The hook. On the night of May 13, 1862, the Confederate Navy lost its most valuable transport ship in the Charleston Harbor. They didn't lose it to a Union broadside or a midnight raid. They lost it to a man they considered property. While the white officers slept ashore in violation of orders, a 23-year-old enslaved pilot put on the captain's tall straw hat, lit a cigar to hide his face in the shadows, and navigated a ship full of explosives past 5 lethal Confederate forts. This is the true story of Robert Smalls, the man who piloted himself from a slave deck to the halls of Washington, D.C. Chapter 1. The Rhythms of the Low Country. The air in Beaufort, South Carolina was thick enough to chew. It smelled of plowed pluff mud, salt marsh, and the suffocating sweetness of jasmine. For young Robert, born behind the house of his master Henry McKee, the world was measured in the tides of the Beaufort River. Unlike the field hands whose backs were mapped with the scars of the lash, Robert grew up in a strange liminal space. He was a houseboy, favored by McKee, often allowed to sleep in the main house. His mother, Lydia, watched this favoritism with a cold, sharpening fear. She knew that a slave who didn't understand the cruelty of the system was a slave who would eventually be crushed by it. "You see them trees, Robert?" Lydia whispered one evening, pointing toward the sprawling live oaks draped in Spanish moss. "They look beautiful, but their roots are drinking the blood of our people. Don't you ever forget you're a bird in a cage, even if the bars are gold-plated." To ensure he understood, Lydia forced him to watch the public whippings at the Beaufort jail. She made him stand in the sun until his eyes burned, watching men and women, people who looked like him, broken for the crime of wanting to be human. It worked. The favored boy developed a heart of flint. By the time he was 12, McKee sent Robert to Charleston to be hired out. He took to the docks like a gull to the wind. He worked as a hotel waiter, then a lamplighter, but his eyes were always on the Cooper River. He learned the language of the rigging, the temperaments of the tides, and the secret geometry of the harbor. By 19, he was a wheelman, the unofficial pilot of the CSS Planter, a luxury transport turned Confederate dispatch boat. He knew the Charleston Harbor better than the men who owned it. Chapter 2. The Shadows of Secession. 1861 felt like a fever dream. Charleston was the heartbeat of the rebellion. When the first shots fired on Fort Sumter, Robert watched from the deck of the Planter. He saw the plumes of smoke and heard the roar of the cannons that signaled the start of a war over his own skin. As a black man on a Confederate ship, Robert was a ghost in the machine. The white officers, Captain Relay and his mates, spoke freely in front of him. They discussed troop movements, the locations of underwater mines, torpedoes, and the secret signals used to pass the harbor's daunting fortifications, Fort Johnson, Fort Moultrie, and the grim stone face of Fort Sumter. He memorized it all. Every flag hoist, every whistle blast, every shallow sandbar. He was married now to Hannah Jones, a hotel maid. They had 2 children. One afternoon, as the Union blockade tightened its grip on the coast, Robert looked at his daughter Elizabeth. He realized that at any moment the McKee family's deaths were a whim of the law, could tear his family apart. "I'm going to take the ship," he told Hannah in their small apartment on Simmons Street. Hannah paled. "They'll hang you, Robert. They'll hang all of us." "The Vicksburg is out there," Robert said, gesturing toward the dark Atlantic where the Union ships sat like silent predators. "If we stay, we're pieces of wood to be burned. If we go, we might be people." Chapter 3. The Midnight Gamble. The opportunity arrived on the evening of May 12, 1862. The Planter was docked at Southern Wharf, loaded with 4 large guns and 200 pounds of ammunition intended for Confederate batteries. In a stroke of ego-driven negligence, the 3 white officers decided to spend the night ashore, leaving the crew, all enslaved men, unsupervised. This was the moment. Roberts signaled the other crewmen. They were terrified, but Roberts' resolve was infectious. "We're going to pick up the families at the North Atlantic Wharf," he commanded. Under the shroud of a moonless night, they eased the Planter away from the dock. They stopped at a hidden pier to pick up Hannah, the children, and the wives of the other crewmen. When Hannah stepped onto the deck, she was trembling so hard she could barely stand. "If we are caught," Robert told the crew, "we blow the magazine. We do not go back to the chains. We go to God." At 3 a.m., the Planter began its gauntlet. To any observer on the shore, it looked like a routine Confederate mission. Robert wore the captain's trademark wide-brimmed straw hat. He stood in the wheelhouse, his back arched just like Captain Relay's. He even mimicked the way the captain leaned against the window. Chapter 4. Passing the Gates of Hell. The ship approached Fort Johnson. Blast! 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 Robert sounded the correct signal on the steam whistle. The sentry, seeing the familiar silhouette and hearing the correct code, waved them through. Then came the Titan, Sumter. This was the most dangerous point. The massive cannons of Sumter could vaporize the Planter with a single well-aimed shot. As the ship drew closer to the island fortress, the crew retreated below deck, huddled in the dark, praying in whispers. Only Robert and 2 others remained visible. The sun was just beginning to bleed over the horizon, gray and hazy. Robert pulled the whistle cord. The signal for friend echoed across the water. A long silence followed. The minutes felt like hours. Then the lookout at Sumter shouted down, "Pass, Planter!" Robert didn't speed up. He knew that any sudden change in pace would trigger suspicion. He maintained a steady, leisurely clip until he was well out of range of the fort's guns. Only then did he call for full steam. "Look!" one of the men cried. The Confederate flag was still flying from the mast. They tore it down and hoisted a white bedsheet Hannah had brought from home. As they approached the Union blockade ship, the USS Onward, the Federal sailors prepared to fire. They saw a Confederate ship charging toward them in the morning mist, but the lookout spotted the white flag just in time. Robert pulled alongside the Onward. He stepped to the rail, took off the captain's hat, and shouted to the stunned Union sailors, "Good morning, sir. I've brought you some of the United States' guns."